He bought a painting for $1 million, only to discover that it was a portrait of the family he never knew he had. The auction hall in Manhattan was filled with quiet conversations, the soft rustle of expensive fabric, and the faint clinking of glasses. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting warm golden light over the rows of polished wooden chairs and the elegant stage where the final pieces of the evening were being presented. Most of the guests were collectors, investors, or people who simply enjoyed being seen in places where art and money met. At the back of the hall sat Adrian Blake. He was not the kind of man who usually attended art auctions. His world was built from contracts, negotiations, and numbers that moved markets. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology corporations in the United States, Adrian was known as a man who made decisions quickly and rarely looked back. He was 36 years old, tall, with light blonde hair and striking blue eyes that often seemed colder than the steel skyscrapers surrounding his office in Midtown. In business magazines, journalists liked to describe him as brilliant, ruthless, and almost impossible to read. His success story had become something of a legend in the startup world. But tonight he wasn't thinking about investors or expansion plans. In fact, he almost hadn't come at all. One of his clients had insisted on meeting here earlier in the evening, and after the meeting ended, Adrian simply stayed in his seat while the auction continued. The room gradually emptied as the most expensive pieces were sold, and many guests had already begun leaving. He checked his watch once, ready to stand up. Then the auctioneer spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final piece of the evening." Two assistants carefully rolled a large painting onto the stage and placed it on a stand beneath the lights. At first Adrian barely looked. But then something made him raise his eyes. The painting showed a quiet autumn park. Leaves in warm shades of gold and amber covered the ground, and soft afternoon sunlight filtered through tall trees. In the center of the scene stood a simple wooden bench. Sitting on that bench was a young woman. Her brown curly hair fell loosely over her shoulders, catching the light and soft copper tones. Her expression was calm, but there was something deeper in it, something gentle and almost fragile. Her blue eyes were turned toward the two small girls standing beside her. The girls looked about 4 years old. Both had bright blonde curls that danced around their faces as if caught in a breeze. One of them leaned against the woman's shoulder, while the other was laughing and pulling at her hand. It was a simple scene. No dramatic colors. No complicated symbolism. Just a mother and her children in a quiet moment of happiness. And yet the painting held something powerful in it. Something so real that it felt less like art and more like a memory captured in oil and light. Adrian straightened in his chair without realizing it. For a moment he couldn't explain why. The woman's face stirred a strange feeling in him, like a distant echo of something long forgotten. The auctioneer began speaking again. The title of the piece is Quiet Happiness. The artist is L. Hart, a Brooklyn-based painter known for emotionally expressive contemporary portrait work. Adrian barely heard the rest. His attention was locked on the painting. The woman's features were delicate but familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. The curve of her smile, the softness in her gaze, it felt as if he had seen that expression somewhere before, years ago, in another life. He leaned forward slightly. The two little girls beside her were painted with incredible care. Their eyes shone with bright curiosity, and the way they held the woman's hand suggested complete trust. They looked safe, protected, loved. For reasons he couldn't explain, the image stirred something uncomfortable deep inside him. A feeling that didn't belong in the controlled, efficient world he had built around himself. Opening bid, $200,000, the auctioneer announced. A few hands rose lazily around the room. 200. 250. 300. The bidding moved slowly. Some collectors were interested, but the energy in the room remained relaxed. It was the last item of the night, and many people were already distracted. Adrian's gaze never left the painting. There was something haunting about it. Not sadness exactly, but a quiet depth that made him wonder about the story behind it. The woman's smile was warm, yet her eyes carried the faintest trace of something else, something that looked almost like longing. 400,000. 450. 500. The numbers echoed through the hall. Adrian felt a strange tension building in his chest. He didn't know the artist. He had never collected paintings before. Yet the thought of someone else taking that canvas away suddenly felt wrong, almost unbearable. It was irrational. He knew that. Still, his hand lifted slightly from the armrest. 600,000, someone near the front called. The auctioneer nodded. 600,000. Do I hear 7? A pause followed. Adrian spoke before he had time to think. 1 million. The entire room went silent. Several heads turned toward the back rows. The auctioneer blinked once, clearly surprised by the sudden jump in price. $1 million, he repeated slowly. Do we have a higher bid? No one moved. The collectors who had been bidding earlier simply exchanged glances. The price had leapt far beyond what they were willing to pay. The auctioneer lifted the gavel. 1 million going once. Adrian felt his pulse steady, though he wasn't sure why. Going twice. His eyes remained fixed on the painting. Sold. The gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp sound that echoed through the hall. A few quiet murmurs spread among the guests, but Adrian barely noticed them. For a long moment he remained seated, staring at the canvas on the stage. He had just spent $1 million on a painting by an artist he had never heard of. It made no sense. And yet the strange feeling in his chest only grew stronger as the assistants carefully carried the artwork away. Adrian stood slowly and adjusted the cuff of his dark suit. Something about that painting felt personal in a way he couldn't explain. What he didn't know yet was that the woman in the painting was not a stranger. And the two little girls with bright curls and blue eyes were not strangers either. Without realizing it, Adrian Blake had just purchased the first piece of a truth that was about to change his life forever. By the time Adrian Blake returned to his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, the city had already sunk into its late-night rhythm. The distant hum of traffic floated upward from the streets below, and the glowing skyline stretched endlessly across the dark horizon. Normally, this view brought him a sense of control and accomplishment. Tonight it felt strangely distant. The movers from the auction house had delivered the painting ahead of him. It now stood carefully propped against the wide white wall of his living room, still partially wrapped in protective cloth. Adrian removed his coat and loosened the tie around his neck, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the canvas. He had bought it on impulse. That was something he almost never did. In business, every decision he made was calculated, studied, and supported by layers of analysis. Spontaneous choices belonged to people who could afford mistakes. Adrian had built his empire by avoiding them. And yet tonight he had raised his hand without hesitation. $1 million. For a painting. He walked slowly toward it. The apartment was silent except for the quiet ticking of a clock somewhere behind him. When he reached the wall, he carefully pulled away the remaining cloth and stepped back. The painting looked even more striking under the soft lights of his penthouse. The warm autumn colors seemed deeper, richer. The leaves on the ground glowed in shades of amber and gold. The soft afternoon light wrapped around the figures on the bench like a memory that refused to fade. But it wasn't the colors that held his attention. It was her face. Adrian took a step closer. The woman's expression was peaceful, but not empty. There was life in it, emotion carefully layered into every detail. The slight curve of her lips, the softness in her eyes as she looked at the girls beside her. It felt painfully familiar. He studied the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, the fall of her curls. Then a quiet breath escaped him. Lily. The name left his lips almost unconsciously. Lillian Hart. For a moment Adrian simply stood there, staring at the painting as if the woman on the canvas might suddenly move. 3 years had passed since he last saw her. 3 years since she disappeared from his life without explanation. He had buried the memory deep beneath work, success, and the relentless pace of building his company. In the world he lived in now, emotions were distractions. Sentiment had no place in negotiations or boardrooms. But seeing her face again broke through the walls he had built. His mind drifted backward before he could stop it. Back to a small coffee shop in Brooklyn where he first met her. He had been sitting in the corner with his laptop, surrounded by scattered notes and diagrams, trying to solve a problem in the code for the software he was building. At that time his company existed only as an idea and a few exhausted nights of programming. She had been sitting by the window with a sketchbook. He remembered noticing the way sunlight caught in her brown curls as she worked. She had seemed completely absorbed in the drawing, unaware of the busy world around her. At some point she looked up and caught him staring. Instead of looking annoyed, she smiled. That was how it started. A conversation about art and technology that lasted 3 hours longer than either of them expected. From that day on, Lily had become part of his life with surprising ease. She brought warmth into the narrow, exhausting routine he had fallen into while chasing his ambitions. She listened to him talk about ideas most people found boring and complicated. Sometimes she sketched while he worked late into the night, filling pages with drawings that seemed to capture small moments of life. She had a way of seeing beauty in ordinary things. Something Adrian had long forgotten how to do. He slowly reached out and touched the edge of the frame. The memory shifted. The day she left. He remembered coming home late after another brutal meeting with investors. His mind had been spinning with numbers, deadlines, and the pressure of keeping his fragile startup alive. She had been standing near the window. Quiet. Too quiet. "We need to talk," she had said. He remembered the way her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Then the words that followed. "We should break up." At the time he had thought it was just exhaustion, another argument waiting to happen. Relationships had always been difficult while he built the company. He worked too much, canceled plans, missed dinners. But that night she wasn't angry. She was distant. Almost resigned. When he asked why, she simply shook her head. "It's better this way." Those were the last clear words she gave him. Within a week she had moved out of the apartment they shared. Her phone number stopped working, and none of their mutual acquaintances knew where she had gone. At first Adrian was furious, then confused. Eventually he buried the entire chapter of his life beneath work. Success came faster than he expected. Investors poured money into his company, and within a few years it had grown into a global technology platform worth billions. The media celebrated him as a visionary. But Lily never appeared again. Until tonight. Adrian exhaled slowly and forced himself to focus on the painting again. This time his attention moved to the two little girls standing beside her. They looked around 4 years old. Their golden curls were bright and lively, framing small faces full of curiosity. The artist had captured them in motion, one leaning against Lily while the other laughed freely, holding her hand. Their joy was almost contagious. But it wasn't their smiles that unsettled him. It was their eyes. Blue. Clear. Almost the exact same shade as his own. Adrian felt his stomach tighten. He leaned closer, studying the details more carefully. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. The shape of their eyes. The pale tone of their hair beneath the sunlight. Something deep inside him stirred, something he couldn't immediately name. A slow realization began forming at the edge of his thoughts. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. If the girls were 4 years old, and Lily left 3 years ago. No. He quickly dismissed the thought. There could be thousands of children with blue eyes and blonde curls. It meant nothing. And yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. His gaze dropped to the bottom corner of the painting. There, almost hidden among the brushstrokes, was a small signature. L. Heart. Adrian stared at it for a long moment. Then he walked toward the kitchen counter where his phone lay charging. The screen lit up as he picked it up. For several seconds he hesitated. Calling his assistant in the middle of the night wasn't unusual. His team was used to unpredictable schedules and urgent requests. But this felt different. More personal. More dangerous. Still, his thumb moved across the screen. The call connected after 2 rings. "Good evening, Mr. Blake," his assistant answered immediately, his voice alert despite the late hour. Adrian looked back at the painting one more time. The quiet family scene seemed almost alive beneath the warm lights of the room. "I need information," Adrian said calmly. "Of course. About what?" Adrian's gaze returned to the signature on the canvas. "An artist," he replied. There was a brief pause. "What's the name?" Adrian took a slow breath. "Lillian Hart." Adrian barely slept that night. Long after the call with his assistant ended, he remained awake, moving restlessly through the silent rooms of his penthouse. The city outside slowly faded from midnight noise to the pale quiet of early morning, but his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, the painting returned to him. Lily sitting on the bench. The 2 little girls beside her. Their bright blue eyes. At some point he found himself standing in front of the canvas again. The soft lighting of the apartment made the autumn colors glow warmly against the white wall, almost as if the scene held its own quiet life. He studied every detail now with careful attention. The way Lily's hand rested gently on one girl's shoulder. The tiny creases at the corners of her eyes when she smiled. The natural closeness between the 3 figures. It wasn't posed. It didn't feel like something imagined. It felt like a real moment captured with painful honesty. Adrian stepped closer until he could see the texture of the brush strokes. The artist had worked slowly, patiently, building layers of color until every small detail felt alive. Of course she had. Lily had always been like that. Even when they first met, she never rushed her work. He remembered evenings when she sat on the floor of their apartment surrounded by canvases, quietly mixing colors while he typed lines of code on his laptop. Sometimes he would glance up and watch her paint. She always noticed. "You're staring again," she would say with a soft smile. "I'm thinking," he would reply. "You're not thinking," she would laugh. "You're analyzing." She had teased him about that often. About the way his mind broke everything into systems, patterns, and strategies. She said artists and engineers looked at the world in opposite ways. But somehow they had understood each other. Adrian shook the memory away and stepped back from the painting. It was dangerous to let himself fall into the past like this. 3 years had passed. 3 years of silence. And yet seeing her face again made it feel as if only a few weeks had gone by. A quiet notification sound pulled him from his thoughts. His phone vibrated on the table beside him. Adrian picked it up immediately. The message was from his assistant. "I've started collecting information. I'll have a full report in the morning." Adrian stared at the text for a moment before setting the phone down again. Morning suddenly felt very far away. He poured himself a glass of water and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the river. The sky was beginning to lighten faintly in the distance, turning from black to deep blue. He tried to convince himself that this was just curiosity. Nothing more. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. By the time the sun finally rose over Manhattan, Adrian was already dressed and sitting in his home office. His laptop sat open in front of him, but he hadn't touched it. The painting was still visible from where he sat. At exactly 8:30 his assistant arrived. Michael Turner had worked with Adrian for nearly 6 years. He was efficient, precise, and rarely surprised by anything his employer requested. But even he seemed slightly puzzled as he stepped into the office carrying a slim folder. "Good morning," Michael said. Adrian nodded once. "You found something?" Michael placed the folder on the desk and opened it. "Yes. Not a lot, but enough to start." Adrian leaned forward slightly. Lillian Hart is registered as an independent painter based in Brooklyn, Michael began. She's been exhibiting small collections for about 2 years. 2 years? Adrian repeated. Michael nodded. Her earlier work is harder to trace. It looks like she only began showing paintings publicly around that time. Adrian listened carefully. Any galleries? A few small ones. Mostly local exhibitions. Nothing major until recently. Michael turned a page and slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a modest studio building on a quiet street. This appears to be her current workspace. Adrian picked up the photo. The building looked simple, almost forgotten among taller apartment houses. A narrow sign above the door read Hart Studio. She lives there? Adrian asked. As far as I can tell, yes. Michael hesitated slightly before continuing. There's something else. Adrian looked up. What? Michael pulled out several printed images. They're photographs from previous exhibitions. Adrian took the first one. It showed a gallery wall filled with paintings. Every canvas had the same theme. Lily. And the 2 little girls. Different seasons. Different places. But always the same 3 figures. One painting showed them walking along a beach with waves rolling in behind them. Another captured the girls sleeping side by side beneath a blanket, while Lily sat nearby reading. Each image carried the same quiet intimacy. Adrian's chest tightened as he studied them. These girls appear in almost all her work, Michael said carefully. Adrian didn't answer. He continued flipping through the photographs. In one painting, the girls were running through a field of tall grass. In another, they were sitting at a small kitchen table covered with crayons and paper while Lily leaned over them, smiling. The scenes were simple, but they radiated something powerful. Love. Belonging. A life. Adrian set the photographs down slowly. How old are the girls? He asked. Michael glanced at his notes. There's no official information about them. But judging by the timeline of the exhibitions and the paintings themselves, I would estimate around 4 years old. The room felt suddenly smaller. Adrian leaned back in his chair. 4. His mind quickly ran through the numbers whether he wanted it to or not. 4 years. 3 years since Lily disappeared. Which meant the girls were already born before she left. A heavy silence settled in the office. Michael seemed unsure whether to speak again. Finally, Adrian asked quietly, anything about their father? Michael shook his head. No records. No public information. Adrian's eyes moved slowly toward the photograph of the studio building again. Brooklyn. Just across the river. For years he had lived less than 20 minutes away from her without knowing it. Without knowing anything. His mind returned to the painting now hanging in his living room. The girl's blue eyes. Their golden curls. He stood suddenly. Michael looked up in surprise. Mr. Blake? Adrian picked up the photograph of the studio and slipped it into his jacket pocket. That's enough information for now, he said. Do you want me to schedule a meeting with the gallery owner? No, Michael frowned slightly. Then what would you like me to? I'll handle the rest myself. Adrian walked past him toward the door. For years he had been the kind of man who solved every problem from behind a desk, using phone calls and contracts to control the outcome. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely. Something personal. As he stepped into the elevator of his building, the weight of the decision settled quietly in his chest. In less than half an hour he would be standing on a street in Brooklyn. And for the first time in 3 years, Adrian Blake was about to see Lily again. The drive to Brooklyn felt much longer than it actually was. Adrian sat in the back of the car while the city moved past the tinted windows in long streams of motion and light. Skyscrapers slowly gave way to older buildings, narrower streets, small shops, and quiet residential blocks that felt completely different from the polished world of Manhattan. Normally, he would have spent a ride answering emails or reviewing documents on his tablet. His schedule was always packed, every minute accounted for. Today, the tablet remained untouched beside him. Instead, his mind replayed the same questions over and over. Why had Lily really left? Why had she never tried to contact him again? And most unsettling of all, who were the two girls in the paintings? He told himself again that resemblance meant nothing. Blue eyes were common. Blonde curls even more so. His thoughts were simply looking for connections that might not exist. Still, the quiet tension in his chest refused to disappear. The car slowed as it turned onto a smaller street lined with old brick buildings. Some had narrow balconies, others had faded murals painted across their sides. It was the kind of neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors, where children played outside and cafes had handwritten menus in the windows. Adrian hadn't spent much time in places like this in years. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. "We're close, Mr. Blake." Adrian nodded once. The car stopped near a narrow two-story building with tall windows on the ground floor. A small sign hung above the door, simple and unpolished. "Heart Studio." Adrian felt a strange stillness settle inside him as he stepped out onto the sidewalk. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at the building. It was modest, almost fragile compared to the towering glass offices he spent most of his life in. But there was something warm about it too. Sunlight fell across the front windows, and through the glass he could see easels, canvases, and shelves filled with paint supplies. This was Lily's world now. Not boardrooms and investors. Colors and quiet afternoons. He walked slowly toward the entrance. Just as he reached the gate leading into the small courtyard beside the building, a sudden burst of laughter stopped him. Children. He hadn't expected that. The sound came from the yard behind the studio. High, carefree laughter that carried easily through the calm afternoon air. Adrian stepped through the open gate. The courtyard was small but bright, filled with soft grass and scattered patches of sunlight. A wooden bench stood near a young maple tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold. And there, running across the grass, were two little girls. For a second Adrian simply watched them. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Both had light golden curls that bounced wildly as they ran. One wore a pale blue dress, the other soft pink overalls stained slightly with what looked like paint. Their cheeks were flushed with excitement, and their laughter filled the entire courtyard. "Catch me," one of them shouted. "I'm faster," the other answered proudly. They chased each other in wide circles around the tree, completely absorbed in their game. Adrian felt an odd warmth spread through his chest as he watched them. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, yet something about it felt strangely powerful. One of the girls suddenly stopped and pointed toward the open studio door. "Mom! Look what I can do!" The word hit Adrian harder than he expected. "Mom!" A figure appeared in the doorway. Lily stepped outside, wiping her hands lightly on a cloth. Her brown curls were loosely tied back, though several strands had escaped and framed her face. There were faint smudges of paint on her fingers and along the sleeve of her light sweater. For a moment she looked exactly as she had in the paintings. Natural. Alive. She smiled as she watched the girls. "All right, show me," she said gently. The girl in the blue dress spun around in a clumsy circle and nearly lost her balance. Lily laughed softly and stepped forward to steady her. "That was impressive," she said. The second girl tugged at her hand impatiently. "My turn." "All right," Lily said. "But be careful." Adrian stood frozen near the gate, unable to move. Seeing her again after 3 years felt unreal. She hadn't changed as much as he expected. Maybe there were slight differences. Her face carried a little more maturity, her movements a quiet confidence he didn't remember before. But her eyes were the same. The same deep blue. The same warmth he had once known so well. Then one of the girls suddenly stopped running. She turned toward the gate. Toward him. Her bright eyes widened slightly. "Mom," she said softly. Lily looked up. Her gaze followed the direction of the child's finger. And then she saw him. For a brief moment she didn't react at all. It was as if her mind needed time to understand what her eyes were seeing. The cloth slipped slowly from her hand and fell onto the grass. The courtyard became completely silent. Adrian felt every muscle in his body tense as their eyes met. Shock spread across Lily's face. Not anger. Not fear. Something deeper. Something complicated. "Adrian," she whispered. The sound of his name carried softly through the air between them. The two little girls looked back and forth between the adults, confused by the sudden stillness. Adrian took one step forward before he even realized he was moving. Up close he could see the subtle changes time had brought. There were faint shadows beneath Lily's eyes, the kind that came from long nights and responsibilities. But her expression still held the same quiet strength he remembered. For a moment neither of them spoke. 3 years of unanswered questions hung heavily between them. Finally one of the girls tugged on Lily's sleeve. "Mom," she asked curiously, "who is that?" Lily opened her mouth but no words came out. Her gaze remained locked on Adrian. And in that moment Adrian realized something with sudden, unsettling clarity. The girl's eyes. They were the same color as hers. But the shape. The shape looked very familiar. One of the girls took a few small steps closer to Adrian, studying him openly with the fearless curiosity only children possessed. "You look funny," she announced. The other girl joined her, peeking from behind her sister's shoulder. "You have the same eyes as us," she said. Adrian felt his heart beat harder against his ribs. He crouched slightly so he was closer to their height. For a second he didn't know what to say. The girls watched him with bright interest, completely unaware of the storm of emotions swirling through the adults behind them. Behind the children, Lily stood perfectly still. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. And Adrian suddenly understood that this meeting, the one he had imagined 100 different ways during the drive, was nothing like he expected. Because the answers he had come looking for were standing only a few steps away from him. And they had golden curls, blue eyes, and the same quiet presence that made his chest tighten with a feeling he wasn't yet ready to name. For several seconds no one moved. The quiet courtyard that had been full of laughter only moments ago now felt strangely suspended in time. Adrian remained crouched in front of the two girls, while Lily stood a few steps away near the studio door, her face pale and tense. The girls, however, felt none of the tension. They looked at Adrian with open curiosity, the way children did when encountering someone new who seemed interesting rather than threatening. The one in the blue dress tilted her head slightly. "You didn't answer," she said seriously. Adrian blinked, pulled back from his racing thoughts, and forced a small smile. "You're right," he said gently. "I didn't." He glanced briefly at Lily, silently asking permission he wasn't sure he had the right to request. She still hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide with shock and something deeper, something like fear. Adrian looked back at the girls. "My name is Adrian," he said calmly. The girl in pink overalls stepped closer and examined him carefully, as if trying to decide whether he was trustworthy. "I'm Emma," she announced proudly. She pointed to the other girl. "And that's Sophie." Sophie waved. "Hi." Adrian nodded slowly. "Hi, Emma." "Hi, Sophie." Even saying their names felt strangely heavy, like opening a door that had been locked for years. Behind them Lily finally seemed to gather herself. "Girls," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Why don't you go inside and finish your drawings?" Emma frowned. "But we're playing." "I know," Lily replied gently. "Just for a little while." The girls exchanged a quick look. They were clearly reluctant, but Lily's voice carried a quiet authority they were used to obeying. Okay, Sophie sighed. Emma pointed at Adrian as if making a promise. Don't leave. Adrian couldn't help smiling faintly. I'll try not to. The two girls ran toward the open studio door, their curls bouncing as they disappeared inside. The moment the door closed behind them, the atmosphere changed completely. The courtyard became silent again. Adrian stood slowly. Now there was nothing between him and Lily except a few steps of grass and 3 years of unanswered questions. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Up close he could see emotions moving across her face too quickly to fully read: shock, guilt, anxiety, and something else that looked dangerously close to sadness. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. Her voice had regained some control, but the tension beneath it was obvious. Adrian studied her carefully. That's not exactly the welcome I imagined. You shouldn't have come, she repeated. He took one step closer. I saw your painting. Her gaze flickered for a brief second. Which one? The one at the auction. The silence that followed seemed to confirm something. Adrian continued. The one with you and the girls in the park. Lily's shoulders stiffened slightly. Adrian searched her face. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. The question came out more quietly than he intended. Lily looked away for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the studio window where the girls were now faintly visible inside, bent over a table covered with crayons. You weren't supposed to find out like this, she murmured. Adrian let out a slow breath. That's not an answer. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth she had picked up earlier. It's the only one I have. Adrian shook his head slowly. No, Lily. You disappeared. No explanation. No call. Nothing. And now I find out you've been living 20 minutes away from me with 2 children. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. With 2 girls who look a lot like me. The words hung in the air between them. Lily closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was no point pretending anymore. Yes, she said quietly. Adrian felt his chest tighten. Yes, what? They're yours. The simple sentence hit him harder than anything he expected. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. He stared at her as if trying to understand the meaning of the words. My daughters? He said slowly. Lily nodded. Emma and Sophie's laughter drifted faintly through the studio window behind them, completely unaware that their lives had just shifted in a way they couldn't yet understand. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. Therefore, he said, Yes. You left 3 years ago. Yes. The math formed quickly in his mind. You were already pregnant. Yes. Her quiet answers only made the shock stronger. Adrian took another step toward her. Why didn't you tell me? This time his voice carried more weight. Lily's composure cracked slightly. I tried, she said. When? Before I left. He frowned. That's not possible. We talked the night you said we should break up. You never said anything about. I couldn't, she interrupted. Her voice trembled now. You were barely sleeping. Your company was about to collapse if that investment deal failed. You were under so much pressure that I thought telling you would destroy everything. Adrian stared at her. So instead you disappeared? She shook her head slowly. It wasn't just my decision. Something in her tone made Adrian's expression change. What do you mean? Lily hesitated. For a moment it looked like she might refuse to answer. But then she spoke. Robert Grayson came to see me. Adrian froze. The name landed like a stone. Robert Grayson was the investor who had taken Adrian's struggling startup and turned it into a global company. Without his funding and connections, the business might have died before it ever had a chance to grow. What did he want? Adrian asked quietly. Lily looked down at the grass. He said you were about to sign the most important deal of your life. That investors were watching you carefully. Her voice grew softer. He told me if you suddenly chose family instead of work, they would lose confidence in you. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had no right to talk to you. He said he was protecting the future of the company. And you believed him? Lily looked up at him again. Her eyes were full of conflicting emotions. He convinced me that if I stayed, you might give up everything you had worked for. The afternoon light shifted slightly as a cloud moved across the sky. The courtyard felt smaller now. He said you were meant to build something bigger than yourself, she continued quietly. And that I would only distract you. Adrian felt anger rising slowly beneath the shock. So you decided the best solution was to erase yourself from my life? I thought I was protecting your dream, she whispered. The words carried genuine pain. For a long moment Adrian didn't respond. His mind struggled to process everything at once. The lost years. The daughters he never knew existed. The choices made for him without his knowledge. Inside the studio, Emma suddenly laughed loudly at something Sophie said. The sound drifted through the open window like a reminder of what really mattered. Adrian looked toward the studio. Two small figures sat at the table, drawing pictures with intense concentration. His daughters. The words still felt unfamiliar in his mind. He turned back to Lily slowly. You took away 4 years of their lives from me, he said. His voice wasn't angry anymore. Just heavy. Lily's eyes filled with tears. I know. And you decided that was your choice to make. I thought it was the only way. Adrian studied her face for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been sitting quietly in his mind since the moment he saw the girls. Do they know about me? Lily shook her head. No, why? Because I didn't know if you would ever want to be part of their lives. The honesty in her voice was almost painful. Adrian glanced once more at the studio window. Emma and Sophie were now arguing quietly over which crayon belonged to whom. A small, ordinary moment. But something inside him shifted as he watched them. 4 years. 4 birthdays. 4 years of first words, first steps, small victories, and childhood laughter. All of it had happened without him. He turned back to Lily. His voice was quiet, but firm. You should have let me decide that. For a long moment after Adrian's words, neither of them spoke. Lily stood in the middle of the courtyard, her hands still slightly trembling. The quiet around them seemed heavier now, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years. Through the open studio window, the soft sound of the girls' voices could still be heard. They were talking about colors now, arguing over which crayon was the brightest shade of yellow. Their conversation rose and fell in innocent bursts, completely unaware of the storm unfolding only a few steps away. Adrian slowly turned his head toward the window again. It was strange how such a simple scene could feel so overwhelming. 2 small figures leaning over a table. Heads close together. Golden curls catching the afternoon light. His daughters. Even thinking the words felt unreal. He had spent years building companies, managing thousands of employees, negotiating billion-dollar contracts. His life had always been defined by control, strategy, and clear outcomes. But this was something he had never prepared for. He realized suddenly that he didn't know how to act. How did someone become a father in the middle of an ordinary afternoon? Behind him, Lily finally spoke again. They're good girls, she said quietly. Adrian didn't turn around. I can see that. They're kind. Curious. Emma asks questions about everything. Sophie is quieter, but she notices things most people miss. Her voice softened slightly. They both love drawing. Adrian let out a faint breath. That's not surprising. Lily watched him carefully, trying to read the emotions on his face. For years she had imagined this moment in different ways: anger, rejection, accusations. What she hadn't expected was the quiet intensity in his expression now. Adrian slowly walked toward the studio window. He stopped just outside it, careful not to be immediately noticed. Inside, Emma was sitting cross-legged on her chair, coloring with serious concentration. Sophie leaned over the table beside her, carefully outlining a shape on a piece of paper. "What are you drawing?" Emma asked. "A house," Sophie replied. Emma frowned. "That doesn't look like a house." "It's a tree house," Sophie corrected. Emma considered this. "Oh." Adrian felt something shift inside his chest. The moment felt strangely intimate even though they didn't know he was watching. He wondered how many moments like this he had missed. Thousands, probably. Behind him, Lily stepped closer. "They like to draw outside sometimes," she said quietly. "But today it's a little windy." Adrian nodded faintly. For a while they both watched the girls in silence. Then Sophie suddenly looked up. Her bright blue eyes moved toward the window. And she saw him. For a second she didn't react. She simply stared. Then she nudged Emma. "Hey," she whispered. Emma looked up too. Both girls froze, studying the tall stranger standing outside. Adrian realized hiding would only make things worse. He slowly stepped closer to the open doorway of the studio. The girls watched him carefully. Children had a remarkable ability to sense when something unusual was happening. Emma slid off her chair. "You said you wouldn't leave," she said, pointing at him. Adrian gave a small, uncertain smile. "I kept my promise." Sophie walked a few steps closer, her curiosity stronger than her hesitation. "Mom said you're her friend," she said. Adrian glanced briefly over his shoulder at Lily, who stood near the courtyard door, clearly nervous. Then he looked back at the girls. "I used to know your mom a long time ago." Emma tilted her head. "How long?" Adrian thought for a moment. "Before you were born." That seemed to impress her. "That's a really long time." Sophie studied his face carefully. "You still look young," she said. Adrian laughed softly, surprised by the comment. "Thank you." Emma crossed her arms. "Do you like drawing?" "I'm terrible at it." Sophie's eyes widened slightly. "Everyone can draw." "Not me," Adrian admitted. "My drawings look like accidents." Emma giggled. "That's funny." The tension in the room eased slightly as the girls relaxed again. Children accepted people much more easily than adults did. Sophie suddenly pointed at him again. "You really do have the same eyes as us." Adrian felt Lily stiffen behind him. He crouched slightly so he was closer to their height. "I noticed that too," he said. Emma stepped closer, examining him more carefully now. "Mom has blue eyes," she said. "Yes. And we have blue eyes." "That's true." She narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "Is that why yours are blue?" Adrian hesitated for a fraction of a second. Before he could answer, Lily spoke gently from behind him. "Girls, why don't you show Adrian your drawings?" The girls immediately brightened. Emma grabbed her paper and ran over. "Look!" The drawing showed 3 figures standing under a large tree. The lines were uneven and colorful, but the shapes were clear enough. "That's me," Emma explained, pointing at the smallest figure. "That's Sophie." Sophie leaned closer proudly. "And that's Mom." Adrian studied the picture. 3 figures. A family. He felt a quiet ache in his chest. "It's very good," he said honestly. Emma beamed. Sophie held up her own drawing. Her treehouse had a ladder, windows, and something that might have been a bird perched on the roof. "We're going to build one someday," she said. "In the backyard." Adrian smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good plan." Emma looked up at him again. "Do you have a backyard?" "No," Adrian admitted. "Why not?" "I live in a tall building." Emma's eyes widened. "Like a castle?" "Not exactly." "Castles are cooler," she decided. Adrian chuckled. "Probably." The girls returned to the table, continuing their drawings with renewed excitement. Adrian slowly stood again. Lily stepped beside him quietly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Watching the girls felt strangely peaceful and painfully complicated at the same time. They like you, Lily said softly. Adrian kept his eyes on the children. They don't know who I am. They know you're someone important. He turned to her. You mean someone important to you? Lily hesitated. Yes. The room fell quiet again. Adrian's mind continued processing everything he had learned. 4 years. 2 daughters. A life that had grown quietly without him. Finally he spoke again, his voice calm but steady. I'm not walking away from them. Lily looked at him carefully. I didn't think you would. I miss 4 years, he continued. His gaze moved back to the girls. But I won't miss the rest. Lily's eyes filled with emotion she tried to hide. Emma suddenly looked up again. Mom. Yes? Can Adrian come draw with us? Lily and Adrian exchanged a brief glance. Adrian smiled slightly. I warned you, he said. My drawings are terrible. Emma grinned. That's okay. Sophie nodded seriously. We'll teach you. Adrian stayed in the studio longer than he had expected. At first he only sat beside the girls while they continued their drawings, carefully following their instructions about which crayons to use and where the sun should be placed in the corner of the paper. Emma took her role as teacher very seriously, correcting him every time his lines went crooked. Sophie, quieter but just as observant, occasionally leaned over to adjust something on his page, explaining that trees looked better when the branches spread wider. For the first time in years, Adrian allowed himself to forget about time. He didn't check his phone. He didn't think about meetings waiting for him across the river. Instead, he listened to Emma's endless questions and Sophie's thoughtful observations, answering as honestly as he could. At one point, Emma asked if buildings in Manhattan were tall enough to touch the clouds. When he said no, she looked slightly disappointed and decided that tree houses were still better. Eventually, Lily suggested the girls go wash their hands before lunch. Emma groaned dramatically, but Sophie took her sister's hand and pulled her toward the small sink in the back of the studio. When they disappeared around the corner, the quiet between Adrian and Lily returned. It felt different now. Less sharp, but heavier. Adrian stood and walked slowly toward the large front window of the studio. Outside, the street was calm, the afternoon sun casting long shadows along the sidewalk. He folded his arms and remained silent for a while. Lily watched him carefully from across the room. You're angry, she said quietly. Adrian didn't immediately answer. Finally he spoke. Yes. He turned slightly toward her. But not the way you think. Lily waited. I'm angry that someone else decided how my life should go, he continued. Her expression tightened slightly. You mean me? I mean Robert Grayson. The name carried weight in the quiet studio. Lily lowered her gaze. He believed he was protecting your future. Adrian shook his head slowly. He manipulated you. He gave me a choice. No, Adrian said calmly. He gave you pressure. Lily sighed and leaned lightly against the edge of a table. You don't understand how convincing he was. Try me. She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. He told me about your investors, she began slowly. About how fragile the company still was back then. About how one mistake could destroy the trust people had in you. Adrian remembered that time very clearly. Those early months had been brutal. The company was nothing more than a promising idea supported by a handful of investors who were waiting to see if it would collapse. Robert Grayson had been the one who stepped in with real funding and influence. Without him, Adrian's project might never have survived. Lily continued quietly. He said if you suddenly decided to step back because you were about to become a father, investors would panic. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. And you believe that? I believed you deserved the chance to build what you dreamed about. He looked at her. You think I would have abandoned everything? I think you would have tried to carry both, Lily answered honestly. And it would have broken you. The simplicity of her answer surprised him. You had that little faith in me? It wasn't about faith, she said softly. It was about reality. Adrian looked away again. Through the open doorway he could hear the girls arguing gently over whose turn it was to use the soap dispenser. Small voices. Normal life. Something he had missed entirely. After a moment he spoke again. How long did you plan to keep it a secret? Lily didn't respond immediately. I didn't know, she admitted. At first I thought, maybe one day, when things were stable for you. And then? Then time kept passing. Her voice grew quieter. And the longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine explaining everything. Filled the office for a moment. Then Adrian spoke again. I spent years believing she left because she didn't believe in me. Robert's voice softened slightly. She believed in you more than anyone. Adrian looked out the window toward the endless city. And now I have a family I never knew existed. Robert watched him carefully. And what will you do about that? Adrian turned back. I'm going to be their father. Robert studied him for several seconds. Then he nodded once. That will complicate your schedule. Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. It already has. Without another word he turned and walked toward the door. For the first time since the early days of his company, Adrian Blake left Robert Grayson's office without discussing business. Several weeks later the courtyard outside Lily's studio looked different. A few small wooden planters had appeared near the fence, filled with flowers Emma insisted on watering every morning. Sophie had convinced Lily to hang strings of paper stars between the tree branches, claiming it made the yard feel like a secret garden. Adrian now visited several times a week. At first the girls had simply treated him like an interesting adult who was bad at drawing but willing to play. Gradually their curiosity turned into something warmer. Emma liked asking him endless questions about the city. Sophie preferred sitting quietly beside him while she worked on new sketches, occasionally showing him her progress with quiet pride. That afternoon they were all sitting beneath the maple tree. Emma was explaining in great detail why their future tree house needed 2 ladders instead of 1. So Sophie can climb from that side, she said, pointing dramatically, and I can climb from this side. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a good design. Sophie leaned against his arm and held up her drawing of the treehouse. See? He studied the picture carefully. It's perfect. Lily watched them from the studio doorway. There was still something fragile about the new balance in their lives, but it was slowly becoming something real. Emma suddenly looked up. Are you coming tomorrow too? Adrian smiled. Yes. Promise? Promise. Satisfied, Emma returned to her plans for the treehouse. Sophie stayed where she was, quietly resting her head against his shoulder. Adrian glanced toward Lily. For a moment their eyes met. 3 years of distance still existed between them, but it no longer felt like an unbreakable wall. It felt like something they were slowly learning how to cross. Adrian looked back at the girls. 4 years of their lives had passed without him. But as he listened to their laughter and watched the sunlight move through the leaves above them, he understood something simple and important. The past couldn't be changed. But the future was still wide open. And this time, he intended to be part of every moment of it. Sometimes people make decisions out of love, believing they are protecting someone they care about. But silence and sacrifice can create wounds that last for years. In this story, neither Lily nor Adrian wanted to hurt each other, yet life separated them through fear, pressure, and difficult choices. I believe that life occasionally gives us a second chance, but only if we are brave enough to take it.